Whether you like it or not, sports are completely inseparable from the world around them, from the politics of the time, from the culture of the time, and they can be sort of a reflection of those factors. And so I want to talk about a few times when the world outside the Vikings really permeated the Vikings in their history. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. The show is on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hope y'all had a great weekend. Today, I want to talk about some of the times that specifically race played into the Vikings. Now, look, a lot of people don't like it when you do that, when you bring race in, but that's a completely inescapable reality, especially when it comes to sports. Sports are a thing with race in it. Like, there is no getting around that. It's most sports, most of the major sports are predominantly black, and anything that is going to make black people that visible, people are gonna get weird about race with it. So if that's you and you don't want to listen to this one, okay, I guess. But this isn't going to be some like preachy thing like putting end racism in the back of the end zones. No, I just want to tell you some stories that I think are an important part of the development of the Vikings as an organization. And the first one starts back in the 60s with specifically Gene Washington and Clint Jones. In a weird way, Alan Page, but not directly. Anyways, it actually goes before those guys were Vikings. It goes all the way back to Michigan State. Michigan State in the mid-60s was one of the first fully integrated programs in the Midwest, in the North. Basically, before that, you had mostly segregated colleges entirely, but that was starting to sort of change thanks to it being a decade after Brown v. Board. Integration was sort of starting to settle in as the sort of norm of the land a little bit more, rather than, just being like one school here, one school there. But football programs were very much one of those kind of battlegrounds because, believe it or not, being integrated was a competitive advantage. And that was a very debatable thing at the time, right? If you look at like newspaper articles from the 1960s about how Michigan State has black players on it, didn't use the word black, but had black players on it. There were people that were like, and I don't know how they're going to get away with it. I don't know how they're going to field a team like that. Like, they thought it was just this like totally inconceivable notion. But I should mention the name Duffy Daugherty, and I should mention the name Murray Warmath, who did the same job Duffy Daugherty did. They were recruiters and head coaches for the Michigan State Spartans for Daugherty, and Murray Warmath did this for the Minnesota Gophers. And Murray Warmath was sort of looking for a similar thing that Duffy Daugherty was looking for. They started recruiting black athletes from the South. Now, in the South, that was highly segregated. Like, in the Midwest, you could sort of integrate things and people might look at you like, are you sure that's a good idea? But there wasn't like rules. In the South, nah, you are not going to integrate your players in the South in the 60s. So any Southern, you look at the University of Florida, it's white, right? And then if you were a good black football player, you were going to go to like Grambling State. And that's how you got to play. And nobody's going to recruit out of Grambling State because there's very clearly still the, inferiority. Nah, they're just like second class, whatever. They're not really good. Until some of these recruiters started to realize, well, no, those guys actually are pretty good, and they're just as good as everybody else. maybe bring him into our team. And so those recruiters sort of brought those players. Carl Eller goes to the University of Minnesota because of that. And he probably ends up a Viking and not something else because of that. And then you have two guys, Gene Washington and Clint Jones, but like Bubba Smith was on those. Those Michigan State teams were totally stacked with guys that were eventual, college and pro football Hall of Famers and all pros and all. Like those teams were ridiculous. And I think it's because, call it a market inefficiency, right? He was pulling from a pool nobody else really cared to pull from. But the players themselves had a really different impact once they got to they grew up, Washington and Jones specifically, they grew up in this very integrated world, the culture inside that locker room was friendly and there was camaraderie and it was very much, to hear Gene Washington talk about it, it sounds like the second act of Remember the Titans. Like it sounds like there was this magic of teamwork to it. And then to get to the NFL and realize that NFL locker rooms were still segregated was a bit of a jarring experience for him. And that's sort of where the next chapter of this story goes. What happened with Gene Washington and Clint Jones kind of after they got to Minnesota. Spoiler warning, the Vikings don't come out in the greatest light here, but we'll get to that when we get to it. First things first, let me talk to you about Blue Nile. Whether you're trying to get a gift for an engagement or a birthday or anniversary or just celebrate that special someone for no reason, go to BlueNile.com. They have experts online and on hand 24/7 to help you customize that piece. If you're going to go online shopping for jewelry, know that you still get the chance to really dial in everything so it's absolutely perfect, exactly what your partner deserves. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On Vikings listeners get $50 off of purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Use code LOCKEDON. That's code LOCKEDON. Plus, every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com today. Hey, thanks again for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft. It started June 16th, so it's going on right now with over 50 insiders. Nothing is equal to the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft. Just like the one we did for the NFL, all of the local experts plus the Odyssey insiders. First pick is already in. It was in June 16th, so go search the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft. Get yourself caught up if you're a basketball fan, and if not, keep on listening. So when Gene Washington gets to Minnesota and Clint Jones, those guys are the first two picks the Vikings make in the 1967 draft. They have 3 picks in the first round. And by the way, they do the whole thing with Jim Finks in a hospital bed because the draft was wild back then. But anyways, they pick Clint Jones and then they pick Gene Washington. And then the third pick in the first round, they pick Alan Page, who played as the only black kid on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish that year. And the two teams had a pseudo national championship. It was awesome. But they bring in a lot of these very outspoken people, to put it lightly, and it turns the Vikings player group into sort of, it seems like, a group of leaders in a way in civil rights. Gene Washington especially is very vocal now, at least, about how that experience was, and Alan Page, of course, becomes a union leader and of course what he did after. But really what I want to talk to you about, I kind of want to fast forward to when Gene Washington left. It's 1972. The Vikings have just traded for Fran Tarkenton, and as a part of a series of trades that sort of went down that offseason, they also got John Gilliam. Now, John Gilliam rocks. This dude's awesome. He's a total deep threat monster. He's a home run hitter type of wide receiver. He was very cool, always open all the time. And his highlight reel rocks. But he was a bit of a foil to Gene Washington. Now, Gene Washington for 4 or 5 years was the guy in Minnesota. And when John Gilliam came to town, Gene Washington was trying to negotiate a contract. And this is according to Gene Washington himself. I wasn't able to really verify it through any other source, but I don't think I have to. He says that in that contract negotiation, the Vikings offer was lower than what Gene Washington made as a rookie. Now, if you don't know, rookie contracts now are that was as of 2011. Rookie contracts were the thing that like were way cheaper than all the rest of the contracts. Before, you would sign a guy out of college, you would draft him, and drafting him was just the rights to negotiate a contract with him, and you'd sign him to a regular contract, right? And if you were watching football back in 2009, 2010, you remember the huge Stafford and Sam Bradford contracts that made the rookie wage scale a thing in the first place because they were like getting out of hand. But back then, you would sign a guy for what you thought he was worth. But it was still like an unproven, rookie signs a deal, and then he is the best dude on the team, the wide receiver one, the number one dude for years, including a Super Bowl run, and you offer him less. He did not take kindly to this. This was not good for the negotiation. Clint Jones was also in negotiations, as was Charlie West, who was a speedy return guy. Those three, I think there was one other guy, but those are the three names I know off the top of my head. Those three decide, because they're all unhappy with their contract offers, and they don't feel that same camaraderie that they felt in Michigan State. Now, look, ask 100 people, you'll get 101 answers, I'm going to guess, about the 60s and 70s Vikings. This didn't seem like it was a place that was super, like, sneering and spitting on each other. And it didn't seem like there was a race war in the Vikings or anything. But I do kind of see where these guys are coming from. They came from Michigan State. It was like, remember the Titans, right? And they come to the NFL where things are a little more by the book for the late 60s and early 70s. Up in the Midwest and all that. Like, I can definitely understand that this is going to feel a little bit different. Maybe not even specifically to the Vikings, but just going from a very special environment in college to a more standard environment is not going to carry the same warm fuzzies that they were used to. And I don't really blame them at all for missing that. At any rate, contract talks are not going well. And Gene Washington and Clint Jones and Charlie West and the other guy, I think, the group of four of them hold out. They decide we are not going to show up to camp until we get a deal. This was not a popular move at the time. It was not unprecedented. It was not by a long shot. Tarkenton had held out with the Giants a year before. I struggled really. I looked really hard for other holdouts that were earlier. And if you know of any, please let me know of them. I couldn't find a lot, though. This was not like holdouts weren't really a mainstream thing until the 80s. And in the 80s, they boomed. There was like this one agent, they called him Agent Orange, who was like, he played hardball all the time. He had a lot of times he had his players hold out for better contracts, and he always got the contract. He was like he's like this revered legend of like agents. He did a lot of that in the 80s, over the course of the 80s. And then, of course, he had the two strikes in the 80s and stuff. Like, this is kind of, a lot of this is, we're in the lead up to really, the 80s was the climax of a lot of this sort of contract negotiation stuff that leads to the way contracts sort of look now. But that is to say, Gene Washington was not the first guy to do this, but I still would call him kind of a trailblazer in terms of just like standing up for players' rights, and specifically as like a black athlete in the 60s and 70s, the courage that takes is I admire it, and I just want to share it. It's really cool. But I want to jump a couple decades later, and I want to talk about the Vikings of the 90s, and Denny Green and Carter and Moss and all that stuff. Because if we're going to talk about the experience of black athletes in the NFL, I think we have to talk about that team. But first, let me talk to you about Grambling. If you want to gramble, all right, NBA Finals are over, but you can still gramble on the Stanley Cup Finals. And you can watch some playoff hockey, get a little money on some playoff hockey so that you can just induce a heart attack. You could bet on the WNBA, you can bet on baseball, tennis, golf, whatever the latest fight is, whatever. You can gramble on all that stuff at Bet Online. Build player props with their player prop builder. You can stack up all sorts of wacky parlays, or you can bet in the middle of a game with their live betting apparatus. You can even bet on stuff like, will the Vikings win week 1? What will their record be? Where will they finish in the division? All that stuff. Go to betonline.net where the game starts. I have an exercise to do together with you. So if you'll come along with me here and play along, I want you to think about Justin Jefferson. And I want you to think about your interpretation of Justin Jefferson's personality. What would he be like if you met him at a party, or if you were tasked with doing a group project with him, or something like that? What do you think that would be like? What would it be like to converse with him, to talk to him, to hang out? Would he be fun? You probably, the word goofball maybe comes to mind. Like, he's sort of just this like happy-go-lucky sort of goofy guy. And I want you to just log that in your memory to say, all right, it's June 20th, 2022. I thought Justin Jefferson was kind of a goofball and sort of a goofy guy that seems kind of fun, happy-go-lucky dude. Because what tends to happen to star wide receivers, especially once they get paid, and Justin Jefferson will get paid. He's going to get that second contract for sure. The perception changes a little bit. I don't think anybody's doing this on purpose. I don't think anybody's being like outwardly, well, some people are being outwardly brazenly racist, but those people are beside the point. The perception kind of changes, Stephon Diggs went from passionate to diva kind of immediately after he signed his contract. And I remember the discourse sort of changing there. I do think that this happens a little more intensely with black receivers. I don't think that many people would argue with that. And I don't think anybody's doing it on purpose. I think it's just the idea we have of Michael Irvin and Terrell Owens and Ocho Cinco. And there's this long storied history of them. And two of those guys were Vikings. Cris Carter and Randy Moss. Now, you probably don't think of Cris Carter in the same way you think of Randy Moss, because Cris Carter, for basically his entire time in Minnesota, was like on the straight and narrow. But of course, he didn't start that way. Most of us know that by now. But Randy Moss was not. And I think these two guys, their juxtaposition is very cool, because they came from very similar avenues of struggle, kind of went through the same doorway that Denny Green opened, and they approached their pro-life and reputation in very, very different ways that were perceived very differently through the lens of, let's be honest, a mostly white football-watching audience in Minnesota interpreting the personalities of two black athletes. That, I don't know, it's just one of those conversations that we should have in June. But for the uninitiated, if you aren't familiar, if you just became a football fan recently or something like that, Cris Carter and Randy Moss, two dynamic wide receivers, both of them in the Hall of Fame now for the Vikings in the 90s and the early part of the 2000s. Cris Carter both these guys grew up in like poor Rust Belt places. Randy Moss ran West Virginia, and Cris Carter was in Middletown, Ohio, and these were like poverty-stricken Rust Belt black neighborhoods. And what's interesting is they both had like that corner. And if you grew up in one of these neighborhoods, maybe you know what I'm talking about. But they both had kind of that spot. Now, a lot of these towns, there are a lot of black towns in America that sort of the only way out of that town is through sports. And that's why I think sports are that's like the biggest reason I think sports are super undivorceable from race, is because for neighborhoods that are defined by race, for a whole bunch of socioeconomic reasons that are not really, this is not the place for them, but for a whole bunch of socioeconomic reasons that we just do not have to get into on a Vikings podcast. But those places are defined a lot of times by athletics, and a lot even more so in the South, where, high school football is like this religious thing. But in those two places, there are these corners that all the great athletes that didn't make it hang out and drink beers and chill. And you can find the same people always on the same corner, and they just kind of go to their blue collar job and whatever. And it's like this like resting area of shame is the way that it's put. And it's of course not that, but if you watch like the Football Life made about Cris Carter, or Rand University, which is what they called the one in Rand, West Virginia, and that's a 30 for 30 about Randy Moss's story. It's like looked down upon almost as this place you don't want to end up. You know, you don't want to end up at Rand University drinking beers with all the other 5-star athletes that didn't make it because they got in trouble or because they, you know, did this or that. But there is sort of a needle that a black athlete has to thread to get to this point in the first place. If you are poor and you're on a scholarship, especially, you know, you couldn't afford school otherwise or whatever, the stakes are so high. You get in a little bit of trouble, you lose your scholarship, you lose your opportunity, and in 2 years you're working at the steel mill with everybody else. That was the kind of the pressure, especially on Randy Moss, but on Carter as well. And that was sort of the context through which they came up. And that pressure, I mean, look, sometimes pressure breeds diamonds. Sometimes pressure just breaks people. But in those two cases, pressure created some diamonds. And they became these, you know, hardworking people, and they had the God-given talents and all that stuff. And of course, you know, they come up through their various stories. But when they came to the Vikings, they both very much needed a guy like Denny Green to be in their corner. Denny Green gave people a shot. It's what he did. John Randall, you're too small, everybody says, we'll give you a shot. You know, Robert Griffith, similar deal. We'll give you a shot. You know, Cris Carter, struggling with addiction. Buddy Ryan cuts him, says all he does is catch touchdowns, which actually Buddy Ryan revealed later he was just doing because he didn't want to say, oh yeah, that dude's a drug addict and he's off our team, because he knew it would torpedo his career. So he like made up something. He said like, yeah, I was kind of trying to do you a favor with that one. Or at least that's what he says. Right. But the, all he does is catch touchdowns line. That was Buddy Ryan cutting him when he was with the Eagles, because he was addicted to cocaine. He failed a cocaine test, and he was in a really, really dark place. And that was sort of the kick in the pants he needed to get clean. And the Vikings, I think, were the environment that he needed to get clean. Specifically, you know, Denny Green and the environment that organization had set up. They had fantastic programs to help with like detox and you know, addiction and therapies and stuff like that helped Cris Carter get clean and be a guy kind of on the straight and narrow throughout the rest of his career. And he really he became so much closer to his faith, I think. I think he was always close to his faith, but it really became the thing he would outwardly talk about. And he became a mentor to everybody, to so many people. And he was, bar none, my favorite. Cris Carter was my favorite growing up when I was a little kid. Cris Carter was like the guy I had posters of on the wall. He was the guy I would always want the jersey of. Cris Carter was absolutely my favorite. And then Randy Moss came along, and he was pretty fun too. Randy Moss took a different approach when he came in. And he very much also needed a guy to take a chance on him, right? People were skeptical. Can he stay out of trouble? You know, he got in a fight in high school, and that was the thing. And he, you know, and he had some problems with failing drug tests and stuff. But really, I mean, with Randy Moss, it was not nearly as serious of an issue as like addiction. It was, dude just kind of wanted to smoke a little weed and party a little bit. But that, of course, that's like back, you know, 20 years ago. That was a pearl clutcher, you know? And with Randy Moss, I think part of there's so many things that make Randy Moss special. One of them was that he really refused to go along with it. He did not take the straight and narrow Cris Carter took. That he was outwardly defiant. You know, they asked him, are you going to stop smoking weed now? You got in trouble so many times. And he's like, nah, I don't think so. I mean, he was the kind of guy that would look into the camera and say, I'm the greatest and I'm going to get away with this. And then he would tell the cornerback, it's like, I'm the greatest and I'm going to burn you for a touchdown. And then he would. And it was that there was a swagger to it. This refusal to be, you know, and this worked great for Cris Carter. But let's be honest, if you are a black wide receiver and you're not like Cris Carter, you're kind of going to get criticized for it. You're going to get criticized for being too loud, for being a diva, for being too, you know, I've even said the word today, outspoken, right? That can be sometimes a little code word, so I apologize for that. But Randy Moss said, yeah, call me that. Screw you. You still got me on your fantasy team, right? Like, there was a defiance to it. And that is especially in adulthood, you know. I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't really know how to process that stuff. And I was a kid when he was playing. But in adulthood, looking back on it, I can have this reverence for both of these guys for choosing the path that they needed to choose and pursuing it with sort of abandon, with this defiant certainty that is, I mean, I wish I had that much certainty in things that I wanted to do in life, you know, and how these guys created the personas that they needed to create, not only to survive in the league and in the public eye, but to thrive. And I think that wide receiver duo, you could talk about them. I could probably do a week of shows about them on the field, but off the field, what they were is so different, and putting them right next to each other on the same team, catching touchdowns from the same quarterbacks, kind of rules. And that defines the Vikings of the 90s for me and of the early 2000s. The Denny Green era of the Vikings was, you can be you, you know, you can be who you are. And Bud Grant was similar to this. You can be yourself, you know, you can be who you are. I mean, you're not going to have to be who I say you can be you. And Denny Green was very much about this. You can be you, and we're going to make you the best you that you are. And I think that has to be what, I think I've said that about 19 times this summer on a lot of the coaches that I've talked about. The best ones let you be who you are, not only on the field in terms of playing the role that you're supposed to play and all that, but personally, you know, saying you be the personality that you are, and we're going to make that the best version of itself. And I think that chapter of the Vikings was just chock full of guys that just needed somebody to let them be themselves and then believe in that. And I think that's how they ended up getting a lot of people really stacked on a team that shouldn't be able to stack that many people in a league with a salary cap and limited resources. And I think that's what led to going to the playoffs every year, and the 98 team that, you know, wrecked everything. That is, I think, what's worth remembering about the Vikings of the 90s, in addition to all of our childlike nostalgia for people my age that remember waking up and watching the game with dad every Sunday, you know. But either way, I guess the overall thesis of today's show is, think about how you think about black wide receivers. Like, I'm not saying, like, check your privilege, like, no, not that. But I mean, when it comes specifically to wide receivers, and watch yourself when it comes to Justin Jefferson, when you think, oh, what a diva when he asks for a lot of money, right? There will be, every time there's a wide receiver contract negotiation, there will be some leak that's probably from the team going to somebody that says he's asking for insert whatever outlandish $30 million a year, whatever outlandish amount of money it will be in a couple years, but or in a year, I guess that's next offseason. But that will happen. And I just want you to think about what's your what's your first reaction to that, right? Just see what it is. Don't judging. Don't say there's nothing that you need to say or whatever, but see what it is and see what you think that says about you. I don't know. Maybe you like the answer, maybe you won't, but it's a good thought exercise to do if you ask me. Tomorrow is Twitter Tuesday. So get your questions in. You can send them to me at Luke Braun NFL or at Locked On Vikings on Twitter. You can also send an email at any time to lockedonvikingspodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to the Google form in the show notes. You can fill that out too if you'd rather. So I will see you all tomorrow. And as always, Skol.